best way to see what the state of the field is to look in the field. So we'll examine our 20 randomly selected peer-reviewed articles, and assess how the 4 areas of data integrity were assessed within each. Again, as we stated earlier, we will look at 5 from the field of nursing, like nursing journals, 5 from social work, 5 from psychology, and 5 from medicine, 5 medical journals. So we'll start with the nursing journals, and I've selected some tremendous authors, great authors, and pieces that I actually really like. Other, outside of the checks and data integrity, they were terribly sophisticated and rigorous. So, but what we're just going to look at are the checks of data integrity. Articles in all fields generally tend to be very heavy with the content, right? The content's often right on the money. It's lucid, it's sophisticated. It's the statistics and the checking of data integrity that are often not top heavy, right? So those are the areas we're looking at. So to be very, very fair to all the articles, we're looking at the things that are most likely, to not be as bolstered as they might be. So the first one, correlates among cognitive beliefs, EBD implementation. You see a nice long, title there, right? So it's basically EBP beliefs, right? The factors that predict them. I've had some very fine authors in a very fine journal, Nursing Outlook, in 2010. Now, if we look just at the checks of data integrity that we just mentioned, right? So the article used correlations, right? So these are parametric tests that assume, things like linearity and normality and, right, all these things that we talked about, right? So in the first article, there's no mention of statistical power. So there's an N of 58, which is actually considered rather small. Right? It depends who you ask. Among economists, they're used to working with thousands of people, so even a few hundred is small. Among the nursing journals, 58 is rather small, but it's not teeny tiny. However, it's not the number itself we're looking at. It's, do we have enough people to generate enough statistical power to test the research questions? And we actually don't know. It's actually rather small number, right? So that's the first issue that we take with the findings. What were the findings? And if there weren't significant findings, was that a true finding, or was that due to a lack of statistical power? Now, the test assumptions, we saw there are many, including the outliers, right, influence of outliers, which really carry a strong possibility of affecting the outcomes. So there were no reports of any test assumptions done whatsoever. There was no mention of missing data, so we don't know the problems we described in missing data were addressed. And also, in the measurement tools, the one thing we're looking at is the Cronbach's alpha, and the appropriate Cronbach's alpha. The Cronbach's alpha was reported for appropriate applicable scales. So all in consideration, we just have the Cronbach's alpha, and everything else was actually not mentioned. Now, the next article, now these will come together, and we're going to cross-reference them after we go through the first 5. Right? Changes in childhood risk-taking and safety behavior after a peer group media intervention by Kenania Chen in Nursing Research 2009. So this study actually looked at changes over time, right? So it's a general linear model. So technically, it's sort of like a multiple linear regression. Looks at linear relationships at one time point usually. So here we are looking at the relationship of 4 time points. So it's almost like it's a general linear model. It's like a linear regression with 4 time points. So all the requirements of parametric testing that we mentioned are applied here. Now the first thing is we have statistical power. It's not reported, and there's an N of 122 people. So you need more statistical power usually when you're looking at multiple time points than 1 time point. So 122 people might be enough for 1 time point, but is it enough for 4 time points? We don't know because the estimates of statistical power were not provided. There was no mention of test assumptions, right? And also there was no mention of missing data. Particularly, there's also no mention of attrition. So it's 4 time points. What was the attrition, right? The people that dropped out in those time points, and how was that dealt with? Right? So we didn't see that. We don't know that. Right? So, and if there was no attrition, which is unlikely, but if there was none, the study should still state there was no attrition. So we know we don't have to make any assumptions. And then lastly, the measurement tools, again, the Cronbach's alpha was reported. So you'll start to see this actually as a pattern. The fact that the Cronbach's alpha is paid attention to, but the other areas are not paid attention to as heavily. Now the third one, why do elders delay responding to heart failure symptoms? By Juergens et al. In Nursing Research in 2009. So they used a correlation and multiple linear regression, right? So parametric tests that require the test assumptions and all the other checks of data integrity that we mentioned. Now we have 77 people. Is that enough? Well, we're not sure because statistical power is not stated, right? The results of a power analysis saying whether we can detect a small effect, a medium effect, or a large effect between the independent-dependent variable, we don't know because the power analysis was not indicated. So that's the first thing that we're bearing in mind. Now, in terms of test assumptions, this one paid the most attention to test assumptions. Now, first, normality, there was no formal statement saying, continuous variables were assessed for normality, and this was the result. There was a mention of a logs transformation, which is often done when variables are non-normal. So there was a mention of it, so we might assume, which is dangerous to assume and we don't want to, but we might assume normality was assessed because a logs transformation was mentioned. However, that might not be a common recognition among most readers. As in, they don't see log transformation and think there was a non-normal variable that was transformed. The next one, homoscedasticity, that was not mentioned. They did a good job mentioning multicollinearity, so that was very, very nice to see. And the influence of outliers, there was not like an outward statement saying that there were outliers and they were examined and removed and their effect was studied. There was a mention, right, so we have yes with a question mark, there was a mention of using a median score to control for the effect of outliers, but that's all we know. So this actually, out of all the papers that we'll look at in part 1 here, this paid the most attention to the test assumptions. There is no mention of missing data, but they did describe the Cronbach's alpha for all the appropriate scales. So many checks were addressed, but not all. And actually, that's a very interesting. It's a very interesting development because you could speculate if the other checks were conducted and just not mentioned, or were a partial number of the checks. So, the researcher realized there were some checks, but not the others. But we don't really know. Okay, the fourth article, Implementing Evidence-Based Practice, Effectiveness of Structured Multifaceted Mentorship Program, by Walden et al. In the Journal of Advanced Nursing, 2010. So here we have another fine article. Use correlations. Sometimes it's a correlational analysis or a correlational study. Right? So statistical power was not mentioned. However, there was an N of 159. So statistical power, if you're familiar with it, it's not specific to a study. There's a certain number of people needed with a certain test. So if you know statistical power, you might be able to say, for a correlation, 159 study participants is sufficient statistical power for a medium or small effect. But that's if you're familiar with statistical power and power analysis. That's why it's always nice to state it, because not everyone is. So the test assumptions were not mentioned. The missing data were not mentioned. But again, the measurement tools, right, they did mention the Cronbach's alpha. So this seems to be this kind of acknowledgement that people know they need to look at the Cronbach's alpha, but the trend is to look at that and not the other pieces. Okay, now the last one. Translating the diabetes prevention program to primary care, right? Nursing Research 2009 and Whitmore et al. So we're looking at changes in childhood risk-taking. Again, we have a general linear model with 4 time points. So again, parametric test. So we need to look at all the requirements of parametric testing, the test assumptions, and so on. So the second bullet here, statistical power. You'll notice there's a question mark after the yes, right? Now 4 time points is a fair number of time points, and the N of 58 is kind of a small sample. So at face value, it doesn't look like there's enough statistical power. However, they did mention that the sample size was chosen based on a power analysis. So I give it a question mark because at least they said power analysis in the actual article, right? So that was nice to see. But you know, the actual results of the power analysis weren't stated, you know, like definitively, as if to say, you know, power analysis indicated that, you know, we have sufficient statistical power to detect a medium-sized effect, and like that sort of thing was not mentioned. The test assumptions, right? So none of the test assumptions were mentioned. And again, these are, you know, like really good articles, but for some reason there's just this trend, right? So the test assumptions were not mentioned. However, a log transformation was mentioned, so maybe they did examine normality. Now, missing data was mentioned, but this is sort of what we were worried about, right? So missing data and attrition were mentioned, which was very nice. But the missing data said they did mean substitution for up to 15% of missing data. And so we just saw that mean substitution actually right, negatively impacted our findings, right? So mean substitution. So this is the point. Is the other studies may have done mean substitution too. We don't know. And we saw what mean substitution did to our analysis between income and happiness. And this is the only article that of the nursing articles we have that mention missing data, and they reported that they actually did mean substitution for up to 15% of the data were missing for a case, which is, you know, a fair number. So measurement tools, yes, they reported the Cronbach's alpha, so that was very good. So if we have a summation of these articles, right, so the first check, the power analysis, study 1, no. Study 2, no. Study 3, no. Study 4, no. And then study 5, yes, with a question mark. Right? So they mentioned a power analysis, but the findings of the power analysis were not described in detail. So of these 5 articles, how do we know which has sufficient study participants to detect a small, medium, and large effect size between the independent and dependent variable? The answer is we don't know. So the first thing right off the bat for all the articles is we don't know if there's enough people used in the sample for the findings to reveal, true relationships between variables. The test assumptions. Now we saw, we just took a little taste of the test assumptions and saw they could really influence the findings. And those are just two of several that need to be made. And in the articles, right, almost all the articles didn't mention test assumptions, right? And like even outliers, the influence of outliers at least wasn't even mentioned or described. And we saw how an outlier can change findings entirely, right? So for study 1, none. Study 2, none. Study 3, as we went over, there was a partial mention of test assumptions. Study 4, none. And then study 5, none except normality was suggested, right? So all the findings, right, even study 3 only did a partial, right, partial description. So in these 5 articles, which are really rigorous, well thought out articles outside this business of checks of data integrity, right, all 5 articles, the results could easily be based on errors related to checks of data integrity, or specifically here, checks of test assumptions. Now, missing data, we saw how the selection of how to treat missing data really influenced the findings, right? So looking at income and happiness, it was a world of difference how you chose to treat the missing data, right? So it's a big topic, and we only touched on a little. If it was a pin, we only went over the head, and even the head, right, that little part that we went over, had a huge effect on the findings. But missing data in study 1 wasn't mentioned, study 2 wasn't mentioned, study 3 wasn't mentioned, 4 wasn't mentioned, then 5 was mentioned. Missing data was mentioned in study 5, but they mentioned they used mean substitution, which, as we saw, is one of the treatment methods that could really skew findings and misrepresent the data. So how do we know that the findings in each of these 5 studies are not errors due to the way the missing data were treated? And the answer is we don't know. Okay, so now we're going to go over the 5 social work articles in the same way, which and then we'll summarize those too, and that will be the completion of part 1. So the first article is the family level impact of the CHAMP family program, which is an intervention program by McKay, published in the social work journal Family Process in 2004. So the statistics used a pre-post general linear model, so it's parametric, so all the assumptions must be met below, right? So there was no report of statistical power. Now, most of these articles, there were enough people to meet the criteria for statistical power, but it's not mentioned. Like 465, that's sufficient statistical power, but it's just nice when it's stated, as I said. There is no mentions of test assumptions. There is no mention of missing data or attrition. But the Cronbach's alpha, again, just like in the nursing journals, there was a realization that the Cronbach's alpha should be reported, and it was. Now, the next article, Racial Socialization Experiences and Symptoms of Depression Among Black Youth. Now, think about it. We're not just going over statistics here. We're going over findings that are going to determine policy and treatment. Right? So when we look at depression, we want to have specific findings that are valid because they're going to inform how people are treated for depression. If the findings are based on error, the treatment in the real world given to the population might also be an error. So it's not just numbers here and statistical guidelines. This is going to inform policy and treatment. So multiple linear regression was used. No mention of statistical power, a sample of 160, which is actually sufficient. No mention of test assumptions, nor missing data, but the Cronbach's alpha was again reported. Right? So this is a real trend now, where the Cronbach's alpha is reported, but for the most part, the other checks of data integrity aren't acknowledged as well. So number 3, racial identity, maternal support, and psychological distress, right? So these are important outcomes, right? Psychological distress, right, among African American adolescents. Caldwell published in Child Development, which is a tremendous journal. It's a great journal, right? So we're talking about, some really prominent articles here, kind of like the cream of the crop in a lot of ways. So correlations were used. So parametric testing, so we have our assumptions that must be met. There was no mention of statistical power, although there were 521 study participants, which is sufficient. There was no mention of test assumptions. Now, missing data was reported. However, they did what they call a complete case analysis, which means if anyone had missing data, which was 121 people, so originally it was 642 people, the 121 people with missing data were excluded from the analysis. And they also did an analysis to see if they were different, the ones that were excluded. But complete case analysis is regarded as sort of ignoring the missing data, right? Ignoring missing data points. So that's actually not what's encouraged with the cutting-edge treatment of missing data. That ignoring the data is never suggested as the way to go, but that's what happened here. So at least they mentioned the missing data, and they mentioned that they did a complete case analysis. So it's nice to know, because then at least you know what occurred and how the missing data were treated, and you can regard findings with the level of credibility you see fit based on that. So that was very good reporting. And in the measurement tools, the Cronbach's alpha was again reported. Now here we are on 4 already. So antisocial behavior of adoptees, prediction of early history and adolescent relationships. So Journal of Research on Adolescence and Grotevant et al., 2006. Fine article. So let's see how it holds up. So correlations are used. So there's no mention of statistical power, right? There's no mention of the test assumptions, or the sample was big enough. The missing data were not reported, but the measurement tools, again, were reported. So it's important to ask ourselves, why do most researchers realize that the Cronbach's alpha is really important to report, but when it comes to missing data, test assumptions, and statistical power, that doesn't seem to be as important? Right? That's a real question to ponder. And I would suggest it's simply a trend, right? It's the way things develop, like how a river runs, and creates itself. It's just a trend. It's what's developed. However, if we want to increase the quality and confidence in findings, we need to start a new trend where these things are considered. And the last of the social work articles, so my multiple minority status, adolescence, and mental health. So cultural, in the journal, Cultural Diversity, Ethnic Minority Psychology, 2004, by Constellation, Russell, and So. So again, we see the same things, right? So the correlations, parametric testing, and to be fair, in statistics, hopefully in classes, they're addressing when you're doing parametric tests. These are the assumptions. Hopefully in class, it's not just a jump right into the parametric test and looking at relationships. Hopefully there's a foreground where it's discussed that there are these important assumptions that need to be met before parametric testing occurs. Right, so we see there's no mention of statistical power, although the sample was big enough. There is no mention of test assumptions. There was no mention of missing data, but the Cronbach's alpha was reported. So when we sum these up, pardon me, again, in the 5 articles, studies 1 through 5, there is no mention of a power analysis. So we saw in the beginning of this presentation, statistical power is really, really important. And if you want confidence in the findings, you need to make sure you have enough and what size effect you could test for. But it wasn't mentioned in any of the articles. Now the test assumptions, right, so in articles 1 through 5, there was no mention of the test assumptions whatsoever. So were there outliers? Right, they were all parametric tests. So were the findings of all 5 studies due to 1 or 2 outliers within each sample? They very easily could have been. Well, with the bigger samples, the outliers have less of an impact. But you never know how many outliers there actually are and what the effect is. Right? That's the whole point of science, is not to assume and speculate, but to actually provide evidence. Right? So we don't know how the outliers affected. We don't know if normality was met, homoscedasticity, multicollinearity. We don't know anything about any of these factors that could very easily cause findings to be skewed. Missing data. Again, it was actually kind of the same case as in the articles from the nursing journal. Right? There was 4 of them didn't mention missing data, but the one that mentioned missing data, the way that it was dealt with was not, preferable, right? Complete case analysis is not a preferable way to deal with missing data in general. But the fact that they reported it was great, because it could have, the other studies may have used something else that was even less preferable. We're not sure. They could have had the most sophisticated, cutting-edge missing data techniques, or something less preferable than complete case analysis. We have no idea. That's why, as it says in the bottom, we don't know. Are the findings skewed due to missing data? We simply don't know. So hopefully, in summation of part 1, hopefully we have illustrated the need for checks of data integrity. And why is it so important to do them? However, when we went over the articles, except for the Cronbach's alpha, the procedures are rare to non-existent. So confidence in the findings, right, is a big factor. Right? So what's interesting is some of them were partially addressed. So some of the researchers, as I said, they recognize the importance, but do they not know about the other areas? Is there a need for more elaboration and education on these areas? So these are more widely addressed within the research. Right, so that's the end of part 1. And we sure have said a mouthful. Right, so in part 2, we're going to continue the literature review, as in we'll look at the 5 articles from psychology, and then we're going to look at the 5 articles from medicine. And we'll see if the checks of the trend that we identified, where the Cronbach's alpha was reported, but the other checks of data integrity were paid less attention to, if that's prominent within those fields too. Then, of course, we're going to provide solutions. It's not really useful to recognize a problem and not provide a solution. So the solution would have something to do with how can we encourage a more universal application of checks of data integrity within quantitative research. So is there a method that we could employ that would influence quantitative researchers as a whole to know about checks of data integrity and implement them so we could have higher quality research and more confidence in findings? And as we mentioned earlier, we'll suggest that a standard model of data analysis, right, a standard model of data analysis, the 7 steps of data analysis, right? So the standard model would say, first step, second step, third step. The third step would be checks of data integrity. So every researcher following this standard model would know when they got to step 3 to perform the checks of data integrity. And we'll discuss that in greater detail in our next presentation. So I'd like to thank you for attending, and I will see you next week.